Hello, students. In your syllabus, in the fifth unit, literary history of the pre Romantic period and the literary history of the Romantic period are prescribed. Today, we will do the literary history of the pre Romantic period. Now, before the period of Romantic revival was the period in which the classical movement flourished. And this period was known by three titles, that is, the classical age, because in this age, the writers drew their inspiration from the Greek and Latin classics. This age was also known as the Augustan age because it resembled the splendor that was there during the reign of Emperor Augustus. And thirdly, the age was also known as the age of reason and good sense because there was a focus on good sense and intellectualism. So, for over a century, classical conventions were being applied to English poetry. Now, this is the history that I'm talking to you about. Now, the classical writers had established the rule of law in literature. By law, I mean that there was a certain form, there was a certain structure which the writers had to follow. And they were taught to think naturally but express forcibly. In other words, there was no spontaneity, and that is why a kind of a literary technique was evolved, which, in the words of Pope, was nature methodized. So there was a kind of a method in which the poets had to express themselves. Just as the metaphysicals had abused the Elizabethan ideal of liberty, the followers of Dryden and Pope also abused the classical ideal of order and restraint. And that is why art degenerated into artifice. And the result was the revolt against the classical school. It became very clear that the classical mode had its day and it needed to be replaced. Revolt became very visible when James Thomson published The Seasons, a poem which was different both in matter and manner from any that was written during the previous 100 years. So he was the first one to break away from the tradition of how the classical writers wrote poems. Collins and Gray continued this movement. Collins, in his odes, he expressed it differently, and so did Gray in his elegy written in a country churchyard. Though the classical spirit was very strong in both these authors, but the themes and the way they treated the themes was different. Like they did not follow the classical way of writing. The other writers like Goldsmith and Burns also contributed to the revolt by their realism and humor in the treatment of scenes of humble, rustic life. Like in the classical age, the themes had to be grand, the treatment had to be grand. But these writers, they were writing about common, ordinary themes, about rustic life, not about royalty. So, with Cooper and Crabbe and the more revolutionary Blake, who in the real sense were transition poets, the old order was at the point of death. So, the poetry of the pre romantics belongs to the period of transition from the neoclassical to the romantic. There was a change of themes because poems began to be written about childhood memories, about personal emotions, about death, mortality, about personal anguish, and the poets moved towards reflection from the purely intellectual. So, the poetry of ideas gave way to the poetry of emotions. At times, the restraint of form stifles expression. It is true that the poets are often conscious of being out of step with the age, of deviating from their predecessors in style and form. But even as they were innovative, they were not imaginative enough because they were the precursors. They, however, were the poets who paved the way for Romanticism. They were the ones who brought a change in the themes. They were the ones who brought a change in the form and in the style of how poetry was written. Though Thomson, Gray, Collins, Cooper were influenced by the work of Dryden and Pope, who were the uh, classical age writers, but in their poetry, that is, in the poetry of the precursors of Romanticism, of the Romantic period, there is a shift in the subject matter, there is also a shift in the treatment, and almost all of them suffered from some kind of a melancholia, that is sadness, and periods of depression and insanity. Why? Because they were not following the beaten track, they were doing something new. And this is in itself an indication of the kind of emotional conflict that they must have experienced. So the sensibility of the age had completely changed, and the poetry of the pre romantic period increasingly became rural and meditative and also religious and personal. This, in short, is the literary history of the pre romantic period. Next, we'll do the literary history of the romantic period.